Hi, it's Antonis from The Collector, and today I'm joined by Dr. Mark Solms, psychoanalyst and neuropsychologist. Dr. Mark Solms has published more than 250 articles and book chapters, as well as 6 books. And to name a few of his works, he has authored The Neuropsychology of Dreams, The Brain and the Inner World, and The Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness. Of course, he's also the authorized editor and translator of the revised standard edition of the complete psychological works of Sigmund Freud, a monumental work for which we are here to discuss today. Hello, Dr. Solms.
Hello, Antonis. Good to meet you.
Good to meet you too. So to begin the interview, I would like to ask you about the work I just mentioned, the complete works of Freud. And I would like to ask you, what was the most significant challenge that you faced with this work?
Well, there are many challenges, but the most significant one is the one that prompted the publishers to bring out a revised edition of Freud's complete psychological works, namely that there was much criticism of the existing edition, which was published in the 1950s and 1960s. The main criticism being that the translation distorted Freud's voice, as it were, that Freud wrote in a very everyday, evocative, descriptive German language, and that the English translation, which was done by James Strachey, was much more mechanistic and scientistic, that it used technical terms from ancient Greek and Latin, and that it didn't sound the same as the German. So in addressing this criticism, the biggest challenge was, do we need a completely fresh translation with a completely different approach, or do we need rather to revise and correct and update the existing translation? And I decided to take the second approach. I can go into all the reasons for that, but it might take us quite a bit of time. But that was the main challenge. The lesser challenges are simply the fact that the original edition of Freud's psychological works came out, 6-7 decades ago, and there's been a lot of scholarship in the intervening period. So it was necessary to update the edition in light of that scholarship. That was not such a challenge intellectually, but it was a lot of work.
So having reread Freud while translating and for all this monumental work, as I said, which of Freud's ideas would you say had the most profound effect and impact on the field of psychology and beyond?
People don't realize that Freud's major ideas have been accepted and now form the sort of bedrock of modern psychology. It's just that we don't like to acknowledge that. We like to think that we've rejected Freud and we've outgrown Freud and now we're in a whole new world, but it's not really true. The basic Freudian ideas, which are accepted, and I mean it in both senses of the word, that they're basic to Freud, and they also are basic to modern psychology, are, first of all, the idea that whatever else we are, we human beings, are just a species of animal, that we, like all other creatures, are embodied, that we have needs that arise from our biological nature. And this is illustrated in the simplest of facts, namely, we have to eat, we have to sleep, we have to drink, we have to shit. These are basic bodily needs. And that the mind is there, it functions to help us to satisfy these needs. Freud emphasized one particular need, which is the sexual drive, and people make much of that. But that too, it flows from what I've just said. Every species of animal has to reproduce. It's a very basic thing in biology. It's what drives the whole engine of evolution. So that's the first point, that we're a species of animal. We have biological urges, that this is what lies at the basis of all mental functions. The second idea of Freud's is that we must learn how to satisfy these basic drives or instinctual sort of urges, and that we do so in the earliest years of our development, that the critical periods in terms of how we go about performing the fundamental task of mental life, which is learning from experience how to satisfy our needs, that the template is that the die is cast in early childhood. Nowadays, we theorize all of this under the heading of what's called epigenetics. But it's basically the same idea, that the critical developments happen early on. And the third idea, which again is absolutely fundamental to modern mental science, is an idea which, when Freud introduced it, was considered absolutely revolutionary. Indeed, it was considered absurd, namely that most of our mental functioning goes on unconsciously. We're not aware of what motivates us. We're not aware of why we do what we do. But this has been demonstrated experimentally time and time and time again, and it's now taken for granted. We just use different words for it. We speak not of the unconscious like Freud did. Instead, we speak of implicit mental processes or non-declarative memory systems and so on. But it's basically the same thing. Not only is it now generally accepted that most mental functions operate unconsciously, but in fact, that most mental functions operate unconsciously. It's a big shock to our own self-knowledge, but it's demonstrably true.
It's very interesting, your answer, what you just said, because it feels like readers and academics of Freud are constantly called to defend Freud's ideas and explain why Freud is relevant today, why we need Freud. And it's very interesting that you just said that he is so relevant that we don't even think about his contributions to science and psychology.
Exactly.
So could you tell us a bit about Freud's interpretation of dreams, and what are the core concepts in this work?
The fundamental idea behind Freud's interpretation of dreams is that the apparent nonsense of dreams, in fact, is just apparent, that beneath the surface there is a coherent mental structure, that dreams are a meaningful and purposive psychological act, that just as with all of our other mental operations, dreams actually do a certain kind of mental work. They perform a certain kind of function. And Freud was of the view that it was possible to identify what that underlying function is. That underlying function, according to Freud, is that when we're asleep and the higher sort of inhibitory constraints of reality and rationality and reason, that these constraints are loosened during sleep, and then the deeper layers, the more primitive layers of the mind become, as it were, released from inhibition, and so we see more starkly the underlying base structure of the mind. The fundamental emotional, motivational forces are unconstrained in our dreams, and so we get a relatively unfettered access to what is on the mind of the person having the dream. Those are the basic ideas behind Freud's interpretation of dreams.
And how did these ideas influence the movement of surrealism and the artistic expressions involved in the movement?
I think that what you've just asked me to explain, namely that dreams have meaning and that dreams convey hidden meanings, I think this had a very important influence on the Surrealists in that they rather than depicting waking reality, which is what we are all aware of in our everyday lives, they tried to depict what Freud called psychical reality. In other words, this inner world which is revealed in dreams. So I mean, there are obviously different aspects to surrealism, but I think the basic idea, it reflected even in the very word surrealism, is it's, in other words, something more real than the everyday reality, that it includes more about the reality of the mind. That surrealists were trying to depict the world as we experience it in our dreams, and in doing so, trying to depict what is conveyed in dreams. So it used both the form of dreams and also the underlying content of dreams. I think that this is a reasonably straightforward way of indicating what the influence was of Freud upon the Surrealist movement. There were other things in the Surrealist movement too, some of which I think are actually more interesting than merely trying to depict the world as we experience it in dreams, such as, for example, the idea of automatic writing and automatic drawing, which uses Freud's technique. Freud's technique of analyzing his patients was to ask them, to implore them to say everything that comes to their minds without any attempt to edit it and censor it and make it palatable and logical. It's just, you must just say everything. If you say everything, chaotically tumbling out everything that's on your mind, then you can see the underlying structure more easily than if you try to shape it and sanitize it. So that aspect of surrealism, which I think is perhaps less well known to the general public, of automatic writing and automatic drawing, it was a more direct expression of the psychoanalytic method rather than just trying to depict dreamscapes.
Do you think there is in your opinion, a specific artist or artwork from that period that best exemplifies Freud's idea of the unconscious, or another idea that you find was well represented in the Surrealist movement?
Well, I think that the first idea, when I said that they were trying to depict the dream, the imaginary world that we experience in our dreams, with all of its strange discontinuities and disjunctions and surprising contrasts and so on. Probably the best known exemplar of that approach is Salvador Dali, but many others too. I suppose De Chirico comes to mind. More lyrically and intellectually more interesting, Matisse, I suppose. In terms of the second idea that I just said, when I said that surrealism wasn't only an attempt to depict concretely dream-like scenarios, but also was an attempt to experiment with the method of free association applied to artistic media. I suppose the best example of that is the automatic writing of André Breton, who was, in fact, the founder, the formal father of Surrealism, the composer of the Surrealist Manifesto. In mentioning Breton, I suppose I should also point out that it was not only an artistic movement; it was also a sort of it was an ideology. It was meant to be a sort of liberatory philosophy and social philosophy at that, almost anarchic, in eschewing the constraints of bourgeois society and allowing us to more freely express our animal nature and our irrationality and the emotional forces, giving them more free rein. I think this was also an important part of the Surrealist movement.
Do we have any evidence of what Freud may have thought of the Surrealists and their art?
In fact, yes. Freud met with Breton. He also met with Dali. I don't know if he met any other Surrealists, but he actually did have personal meetings with those two. I think it's disappointing, perhaps, to hear. Freud was quite conservative in many ways, and he was quite conservative also when it came to his appreciation of the arts. He was not really very avant-garde in his cultural tastes. So I think he was a little bit skeptical, a little bit bemused by these radical young men. He was not a radical in many respects. So Breton was disappointed with Freud, and he made no secret of it. He found Freud to be upsettingly bourgeois and limited in his vision. And I think the same applies to Dali. Dali thought that that Freud was almost rude to him, but in fact, Freud wrote about his meeting with Dali that he found him very interesting. He said and this part of it reflects his conservatism. He thought that because Dali was technically very good as a painter, so he was surprised to see that this fanatical Spaniard who had such wild ideas actually was a proper artist, in his sense of what an artist's skills should entail. He said that normally when he looks at a work of art, he's speaking here of visual art, he tries to discern what is unconscious, what lies behind the intentionality of the artist, what lies behind what the artist thinks they're doing. He said in the case of Dali, it was the other way around. Rather than trying to find what was conscious, what was unconscious in it, he said he was trying to find what was conscious in it, and which I thought was quite a humorous remark. But Freud was more impressed with Dali than Dali thought he was, but not for very good reasons. I think that Freud was just impressed with his technical prowess. Freud also thought that he was a very strange man, which of course he was, and the same applies to Breton.
Yeah. So can you briefly explain the concept of the uncanny and how it also relates with art?
Yes. Freud, the word that we translate into English as the uncanny, in German, the word that Freud used was the unheimlich. And unheimlich really conveys the essence in a way of the concept, that is, in a way that the English word does not. Unheimlich is a strange combination of two things. Heimlich literally means homely. In other words, familiar, something comfortably, nostalgically, personally reminiscent of one's own childhood in particular. Un means so it's unhomely. It is the familiar rendered unfamiliar. So that's the literal meaning of the word. But what it conveys, what it points to, is phenomena which are both of those things. So, for example, it would be your mother's presence, which should be warm and fuzzy and nostalgic, but her presence rendered in a way that depicts her witch-like or sexual. So think of a horror movie, where you enter your childhood home and you have warm, nostalgic reminiscences, but then the ghost of your dead brother bursts out of the cupboard, or you see your father murdering your mother, in the parents' bedroom or something like that. So it's a conjunction of the homely, the familiar, the fondly nostalgic with something that is shocking, and unsettling, and indeed even traumatizing. It's the conjunction of those two things. And the Surrealists made much use of it in their attempts to depict the unconscious, as I said, where these sorts of things, like in our dreams, we dream of something which, this is like my home, but my God, the things that are going on there are very different from what goes on or went on in my home in the real world. Freud thought that this form of mental event, uncanny mental events, that they represent what is repressed returning. So it is something from one's past, but it is a disowned aspect, a disavowed aspect, an aspect that one tries to sort of suppress, of the more unseemly, the more upsetting, the more disturbing sort of sexual and aggressive elements of our homely childhood life.
And one final question, as we're running out of time. What do you see as the most misunderstood of Freud's ideas, theories?
I think the most understood aspect is Freud's theory of sexuality. In this sense, that people thought, understandably, people thought that Freud saw sex everywhere, that Freud thought that everything was motivated by sexual drives. And so they thought that he went too far. He overemphasized sexuality at the expense of other things. Why I say that this is what is most misunderstood about Freud is that Freud didn't mean the same thing as most people think of when they refer to sexuality. For most people, sexuality means, something to do with the genitals, something obviously sexual, even if it doesn't involve the genitals. It involves behaviors which are clearly sexual, like fetishism or sadomasochism, whipping your backside or masturbating while looking at shoes or something. These are clearly sexual things. But Freud meant much more by the word sexual. Basically, for Freud, anything that was pleasurable for its own sake. In other words, the motivation was pleasure rather than the motivation is nutrition, or the motivation is hydration, or the motivation is thermoregulation, or if there's no obvious survival value in what we're doing, rather we're doing it for purely because it brings us pleasure. For Freud, that meant it's sexual. In other words, he used the word in a very different way. He tried to broaden the concept of what the term denotes, to refer to everything that is pleasure-seeking for its own sake. So if you translate Freud's claim, take away the word sexual, and recognize that all that he's saying is that there are things that we do which are motivated by the pursuit of pleasure alone, and that we can't understand these in terms of rational, practical survival sort of imperatives. These things nevertheless motivate us. It's sort of obviously true that what we are motivated by is what we desire, what brings us pleasurable feelings. So it's in a sense unfortunate that Freud chose to use the word erotic or sexual or libidinal for all of these things, because I think, as I say, it led to a fundamental misunderstanding of what he was really trying to draw our attention to, namely that we are motivated by feelings, not by practical considerations alone.
So thank you very much for this discussion. It was lovely having you. And hopefully we can arrange another interview in the future to discuss more about your field, neuropsychoanalysis and psychology of mind.
Thank you. I would enjoy that, and it was good to speak to you today.
Yes, have a great day.
Thank you, Antonis. Bye-bye.